Winter, 14,000 years ago. A group of hunters stand frozen in place in front of the body of a fully grown woolly mammoth. The animal weighs almost 6 tons. It stands more than 3.5 meters tall, and now it lies there, motionless, on ground that is slowly turning red beneath the snow. They have just done something that the rest of the tribe might otherwise wait months, even years, to see happen again. But this is where the story actually gets interesting. Because killing a mammoth is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a race against time, against scavengers, and against their own people. 6 tons of meat are about to start decaying. And if it is not handled correctly in the next few hours, every ounce of effort and every risk they just took could be for nothing. Today, we are going to walk through every hour, every day that follows that moment. From how they butchered an animal larger than a city bus, to how that massive skeleton eventually became an entire house. Getting to this point already took days of tracking, patience, and enormous risk. Hunters likely followed herd trails for miles, reading footprints, droppings, and broken vegetation to predict where the animals would move next. Some researchers believe groups deliberately drove vulnerable individuals, the old, the sick, or the very young, toward natural traps like bogs, riverbanks, or narrow ravines where the animal's own size became a disadvantage. Cornering a mammoth in soft mud or a steep gully meant hunters no longer needed brute strength alone. They needed timing, coordination, and nerve. Wooden spears tipped with sharpened stone points, some evidence suggests, were thrust into the animal's underside, where the hide was thinner and vital organs sat closer to the surface. This was not a quick death. It could take hours of harassment, retreating, and repositioning before the animal finally went down, and every one of those hours carried the risk of a hunter being trampled or gored. So by the time the mammoth finally collapsed in the snow, the group was not just excited. They were exhausted, adrenaline still running through their bodies, fully aware that the most dangerous and most delicate phase of the entire operation was only just beginning. To understand why that moment mattered so much, we need to step back a little first. Roughly 20 to 15,000 years ago, most of the northern hemisphere was covered by a vast, frigid grassland that scientists call the Mammoth Steppe. It was not a forest, and it was not a frozen desert. It was a dry, wind-swept grassland where woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and wild horses all lived side by side. The people who lived here did not hunt mammoths every single day. In fact, archaeologists still argue fiercely about whether ancient humans actively hunted mammoths on a regular basis, or whether they mostly relied on animals that were already dead or trapped in bogs and ice. But whether it was an active hunt or simply a stroke of luck finding a fresh carcass, for a band of only 20 to 50 people, a single adult mammoth represented an enormous treasure. Let's run a quick calculation. A fully grown mammoth could provide more than a ton of edible meat. If an adult human needs roughly 2,000 calories a day, then this one carcass could feed an entire community of several dozen people for weeks. That is exactly why, the moment the animal fell, nobody in the group thought about resting or celebrating. Because the clock had already started counting down. The instant the smell of blood spread through the air, humans were not the only ones paying attention. Wolves, cave hyenas, eagles, and even rival bands of hungry humans could all catch that scent from a great distance. So the very first thing the hunters did was not start cutting immediately. It was assessing the situation, how much time they had, whether they needed to call for reinforcements from camp, and most importantly, whether they needed to guard the carcass with fire and weapons while they waited for help to arrive. When archaeologists excavate ancient mammoth butchering sites, they often find traces of fire nearby. Fire served two purposes at once. It kept predators away, and it acted as a signal calling the rest of the tribe to come and help. And this is where the real skill began. Because butchering an animal that weighs 6 tons is nothing like butchering a deer. A mammoth's hide could be several centimeters thick, covered in a long coat of hair, with a layer of fat underneath that could reach nearly 10 centimeters to protect the animal against the cold. To cut through that natural armor, hunters needed sharp, specialized tools and a clear plan of action. Experimental archaeology, meaning modern researchers who actually try butchering elephant or mammoth carcasses with replica stone tools, shows that a team of about 5 or 6 experienced people can process most of a large animal like this in roughly 4 to 6 hours. 4 to 6 hours for 6 tons of meat, hide, fat, and internal organs. That is remarkably fast, especially when you remember that all they had were tools made of stone and bone. Here is the part I personally find most fascinating. They did not cut things randomly. There was a very clear order of priority, and that order reveals a lot about how they thought about survival. First came the organs and the parts that spoil the fastest. The liver, the heart, the kidneys, the most nutrient-dense organs, but also the ones that decay the quickest, were usually removed and eaten almost immediately, sometimes even raw. It sounds unsettling, but for hunter-gatherers, these organs were an incredibly valuable source of vitamins and minerals that ordinary muscle meat simply could not provide. Next came the fat. Do not underestimate how important fat was. In a cold environment, calories from fat mattered far more than calories from pure protein alone. Anthropologists have a term for what happens if you eat too much lean meat without enough fat. It is sometimes called rabbit starvation or protein poisoning. If you only eat lean meat without enough fat, the body cannot fully process all that protein, which leads to severe weakness and can even be fatal. So the thick layer of fat under the mammoth's skin and around its organs, the very thing that helped the animal survive brutal winters, became the thing that helped the entire tribe survive those same winters. After that came the large cuts of meat. The thighs, the shoulders, the back, all sliced into manageable slabs for transport and processing. And finally came the parts that most modern people would never even think of: bone marrow, brain tissue, and even the partially digested plant material inside the animal's stomach. It sounds strange, but the plant matter that had already been partially broken down in a mammoth's stomach was sometimes treated as a rare source of fiber and micronutrients in a diet that otherwise consisted almost entirely of meat. Nothing went to waste. Not because they respected nature in some romanticized modern sense, but simply because in a world where the next meal was never guaranteed, wasting food was the same as choosing to die a little sooner. Butchering on this scale was never a one-person job, and it was almost certainly never a job for just the hunters who made the kill. Word likely traveled back to camp quickly, and within hours the entire community, men, women, children, and elders, may have made their way to the site. Division of labor probably followed skill rather than strict gender roles in the way many people assume. Those most skilled with a blade cut the hide and separated major muscle groups, while others focused on cracking bones for marrow or scraping fat from the underside of the skin. Children could have carried smaller cuts back to camp, or kept fires fed with fuel, learning the entire process simply by watching and helping. Elders, meanwhile, often held the specialized knowledge passed down over decades: which cuts spoiled fastest, which parts made the best tools, and how long a piece of meat could sit before it turned dangerous to eat. Toolmaking itself was a craft that ran alongside the butchering, not after it. As blades dulled from cutting through thick hide and cartilage, someone in the group was likely napping fresh stone flakes on the spot, using a hammerstone to strike precise angles off a prepared core. A single well-made stone flake could be resharpened several times before being discarded, and broken tools were rarely wasted either, often repurposed into scrapers for cleaning hides or awls for punching holes in leather. This constant cycle of making, using, and remaking tools meant that a mammoth kill was not only a source of food, it was also effectively a mobile workshop, generating dozens of new or renewed implements the group would rely on for months afterward. Now we get to the part I think will genuinely surprise a lot of you. In Ukraine, at a site called Mezherich, archaeologists discovered something that, at first glance, looks like a prop straight out of a fantasy film. Houses built entirely out of mammoth bone. Not one or two bones used as decoration, but hundreds of pieces of bone. Jaw bones, hip bones, tusks, and ribs, deliberately stacked and arranged to form the frame of a large dwelling, then covered with animal hides to block the wind and retain heat. Some of these mammoth bone houses are estimated to have used the remains of dozens of individual mammoths, though of course those bones were collected over many years from both natural carcasses and successful hunts. Why would anyone build a house this way? Simply put, on the mammoth steppe, wood barely existed. There were no trees to build a wooden frame the way people did in forested regions. But there was one building material that was sturdy and available in large quantities: the skeleton of the largest animal in the region. Mammoth tusks, with their natural curvature, were even used to form dome-shaped structures, an architectural solution that still impresses modern engineers with just how cleverly the available materials were repurposed. This is exactly where the story shifts from short-term survival to long-term strategy. A mammoth did not just feed them for a few weeks. It sheltered them through multiple winters in the form of a roof over their heads. And speaking of tools, mammoth bone and ivory were also carved into sewing needles, spear points, jewelry, and even objects with clear symbolic and artistic meaning, like the small carved figurines found at numerous sites across Europe. One of the most famous examples is a small ivory carving known as the Lion Man, found in a cave in Germany, depicting a figure with a human body and the head of a lion, carved from a mammoth tusk roughly 40,000 years ago. Think about what that actually means. Long before agriculture, before writing, before permanent villages, someone sat down with a piece of mammoth ivory and spent what researchers estimate could have been hundreds of hours patiently carving a creature that never existed in nature, purely as an act of imagination. Flutes carved from bone and ivory have also been discovered at Ice Age sites, suggesting that music, not just survival, was part of daily or ceremonial life around these communities. Beads made from ivory and shell, sewn onto clothing in patterns archaeologists can still reconstruct today, hint at early forms of personal identity, status, or group belonging expressed through what people wore. Some burial sites from this period include elaborate grave goods made from mammoth ivory, thousands of carefully carved beads arranged around the body of the deceased, representing an enormous investment of time and resources dedicated purely to honoring the dead. All of this tells us something important. Mammoths were never just a source of calories. They were woven into nearly every layer of Ice Age life, from the practical to the spiritual, from the roof over someone's head to the art passed down as memory and meaning long after the meat itself was gone. Now let's go back to the most practical question of all. How exactly do you preserve 6 tons of meat without refrigeration and without refined salt? Archaeologists believe ancient people relied on 3 main strategies. The first was natural freezing. If the hunt happened during winter in a region close to the poles, the answer was simply the environment around them. Burying meat in pits dug into permafrost, or simply leaving it out in freezing air, could preserve meat for a very long time. In fact, quite a few nearly complete mammoth carcasses discovered in Siberia today are so well preserved that, even after tens of thousands of years, their flesh remained locked in permafrost. The second strategy was drying. Cutting meat into thin strips and letting it dry in the wind and mild sunlight is a technique that nearly every hunter-gatherer culture on the planet, from Africa to the Americas, independently discovered on their own. Dried meat was lighter, easier to carry while traveling, and could last for many months. The third strategy was smoking. Hanging meat on a rack above a slow-burning fire not only cooked it partially, it also created a protective layer against bacteria thanks to the chemical compounds released in the smoke. And of course, not all the meat was preserved for later. A large portion was eaten right away, in what anthropologists call a feast. This is the part I want you to slow down and really think about. When the tribe brought mammoth meat back to camp, what happened next was not simply eating to survive. Archaeologists and anthropologists believe that large feasts like this played an enormously important social role. Sharing meat was never a random act. It reinforced relationships between families within the tribe, and it created what you might call a social debt. If you give me meat today, I now owe you something in return. Not necessarily meat, but perhaps help, information, or an alliance later on. In other words, this was one of the earliest forms of social insurance in human history. In a world where luck largely determined survival, where your tribe might succeed in a hunt today while another tribe goes hungry, and tomorrow the situation could easily reverse. Sharing surplus resources helped build a support network so that when misfortune eventually struck you, others would help you in return. Some researchers even suggest that these large post-hunt feasts may have been occasions for smaller, scattered groups who rarely crossed paths to gather together, to trade, to find partners, and to maintain cultural cohesion across a vast territory. A single mammoth, almost by accident, became the glue holding an entire social network together. And this brings us to a bigger question, one that is still fiercely debated in the scientific community. Did humans, with skills this refined at hunting and utilizing every part of an animal, actually cause the complete extinction of mammoths? This is known as the overkill hypothesis. Some scientists believe that as humans spread across every continent toward the end of the Ice Age, armed with increasingly sophisticated tools and growing social organization, they hunted so efficiently that mammoth populations and many other large mammals simply could not recover in time. But the opposing camp argues that the real culprit was climate change at the end of the Ice Age, when the vast mammoth steppe gradually shrank and was replaced by forests, meaning the mammoth's familiar habitat essentially disappeared regardless of whether humans were hunting them or not. Supporters of the overkill hypothesis often point to a striking pattern. On continents like North America and Australia, large mammals vanished shortly after humans first arrived, while in places like Africa, where humans and megafauna evolved side by side for millions of years, far more large species survived into the modern era. The reasoning goes that African animals had time to evolve a wariness of human hunters, while animals in newly colonized continents had never encountered a predator quite like us, and had no instinctive fear to protect them. Critics of this idea point out that the timing does not always line up neatly, and that in several regions, mammoth populations were already declining well before clear evidence of human hunting appears in the archaeological record. Genetic studies of mammoth remains have also revealed something unexpected. Isolated populations were struggling with inbreeding and shrinking genetic diversity even in areas with little or no human presence, suggesting the species was already fragile for reasons that had nothing to do with spears or fire. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere between the two positions. Climate change weakened mammoth populations, and human hunting pressure was the final blow that prevented any real recovery. The very last population of mammoths on Earth, a small isolated group living on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean, is believed to have survived until roughly 4,000 years ago, which is around the same time ancient Egyptians had already finished building the pyramids. Think about that for a second. We tend to imagine mammoths as creatures from some impossibly distant, almost mythical past. But in reality, mammoths were still alive when humans had already invented writing and constructed the pyramids of Giza. Every rib used as a roof beam, every tusk carved into a needle, every scrap of fat rendered down for warmth, all of it was part of a single, continuous chain of decisions made under pressure, with nothing wasted and nothing left to chance. So the story of what ancient humans did after killing a mammoth is not just a story about butchering an animal and roasting it over a fire. It is a story about survival calculated down to the smallest detail, about turning a single animal into food, into shelter, into tools, and into an entire system of social bonds. And perhaps it is also a reminder that even with nothing more than crude stone tools, our ancestors possessed a kind of survival intelligence that many of us today, surrounded by shelves full of food in every supermarket, would struggle to even imagine. Next time you open a refrigerator packed with food and barely think twice about it, remember that this convenience is an extremely recent invention in the grand timeline of our species. For nearly the entire history of humanity, every single calorie had to be tracked, protected, and used with almost obsessive precision. If this video changed the way you look at your own refrigerator, even a little, leave a like. And if you're curious how ancient humans faced off against other massive Ice Age predators, like woolly rhinoceroses or saber-toothed cats, drop a comment below, because that might just become the topic of the next video. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next mystery from human history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stick around, because the next mystery from the Ice Age might be even stranger than this one. See you there.